Getting on course to your success. So far in this chapter, as you've been reading, you've been looking at accepting personal responsibility, discovering self-motivation, mastering self-management, employing interdependence. All of these concepts we'll be diving into as we go through the course. You have explored the ideas of money and education, the culture of higher education, which is very different than high school, the expectations of college professors, which requires students to be responsible for their learning, but professors are also there to help motivate students to learn deeply. This lecture will discuss ideas of forks in the road and how we make choices. There are two videos within this PowerPoint. One covers the ideas of mindfulness, and the other discusses the ideas of neuroplasticity and active learning. Let's take a look at Andy Podicom. He is the founder of Headspace today. It is a practicing and teaching of meditation and all sorts of purposes. This video is about 10 minutes long.
We live in an incredibly busy world. The pace of life is often frantic. Our minds are always busy and we're always doing something. So with that in mind, I'd like just to take a moment to think, when did you last take any time to do nothing? Just 10 minutes, undisturbed. And when I say nothing, I do mean nothing. So that's no emailing, texting, no internet, no TV, no chatting, no eating, no reading. Not even sitting there reminiscing about the past or planning for the future. Simply doing nothing. I see a lot of very blank faces. My thinking is probably have to go a long way back. And this is an extraordinary thing, right? We're talking about our mind. The mind, our most valuable and precious resource through which we experience every single moment of our life. The mind that we rely upon to be happy, content, emotionally stable as individuals, and at the same time to be kind and thoughtful and considerate in our relationships with others. This is the same mind that we depend upon to be focused, creative, spontaneous, and to perform at our very best in everything that we do. And yet, we don't take any time out to look after it. In fact, we spend more time looking after our cars, our clothes, and our hair than okay, maybe not our hair, but you see where I'm going. The result, of course, is that we get stressed. You know, the mind whizzes away like a washing machine going round and round, lots of difficult, confusing emotions. And we don't really kind of know how to deal with that. And the sad fact is that we are so distracted that we're no longer present in the world in which we live. We miss out on the things that are most important to us. And the crazy thing is that everybody just assumes, well, that's the way life is, so we just kind of got to get on with it. That's really not how it has to be. So I was about 11 when I went along to my first meditation class. And trust me, it had all the stereotypes that you can imagine, the sitting cross-legged on the floor, the incense, the herbal tea, the vegetarians, the whole deal. But my mum was going and I was intrigued, so I went along with her. I'd also seen a few kung fu movies, and secretly I kind of thought I might be able to learn how to fly, but I was very young at the time, you know. Now, as I was there, you know, I guess like a lot of people, I assumed that it was just an aspirin for the mind. You get stressed, you do some meditation. I hadn't really thought that it could be sort of preventative in nature. Until I was about sort of 20, when a number of things happened in my life in quite quick succession. Really serious things which just flipped my life upside down, and all of a sudden I was inundated with thoughts, inundated with difficult emotions that I didn't know how to cope with. Every time I sort of pushed one down, another one would just sort of pop back up again. It was a really very stressful time. I guess we all deal with stress in different ways. Some people will bury themselves in work, grateful for the distraction. Others will turn to their friends, their family, looking for support. Some people hit the bottle, start taking medication. My own way of dealing with it was to become a monk. So I quit my degree, I headed off to the Himalayas, I became a monk, and I started studying meditation. People often ask me, what I learned from that time. Well, obviously it changed things, Let's face it, becoming a celibate monk is going to change a number of things. But it was more than that. It taught me, it gave me a greater appreciation and understanding for the present moment. By that, I mean not being lost in thought, not being distracted, not being overwhelmed by difficult emotions, but instead learning how to be in the here and now, how to be mindful, how to be present. I think the present moment is so underrated. It sounds so ordinary, and yet we spend so little time in the present moment that it's anything but ordinary. There was a research paper that came out of Harvard just recently that said on average our minds are lost in thought almost 47% of the time. 47%. At the same time, this sort of constant mind wandering is also a direct cause of unhappiness. Now, we're not here for that long anyway, but to spend almost half of our life lost in thought and potentially quite unhappy, I don't know, it kind of seems tragic, actually, especially when there's something we can do about it. When there's a positive, practical, achievable, scientifically proven technique which allows our mind to be more healthy, to be more mindful and less distracted. And the beauty of it is that even though it kind of need only take about 10 minutes a day, it impacts our entire life. But we need to know how to do it. We need an exercise, we need a framework to learn how to be more mindful. That's essentially what meditation is. It's familiarizing ourselves with the present moment. But we also need to know how to approach it in the right way to get the best from it. And that's what these are for, in case you've been wondering. Because most people assume that meditation is all about sort of stopping thoughts, getting rid of emotions, somehow controlling the mind. But actually it's quite different from that. It's more about sort of stepping back, sort of seeing the thought clearly, witnessing it coming and going, emotions coming and going without judgment, but with a relaxed, focused mind. So for example, right now, if I focus too much on the balls, then there's no way that I can relax and talk to you at the same time. Equally, if I relax too much talking to you, then there's no way I can focus on the balls. I'm going to drop them. Now in life and in meditation, there'll be times when the focus becomes a little bit too intense and life starts to feel a bit like this. It's a very uncomfortable way to live life when we get this tight and stressed. At other times, we might take our foot off the gas a little bit too much and things just become a sort of bit like this. And of course, in meditation, we can end up falling asleep. So we're looking for a balance of focused relaxation where we can allow thoughts to come and go without all the usual involvement. Now, what usually happens when we're learning to be mindful is that we get distracted by a thought. Let's say this is an anxious thought. So everything's going fine, and then we see the anxious thought, and it's like, oh, didn't realize I was worried about that. You go back to it, repeat it. Oh, I am worried. Oh, I really am worried. Wow, there's so much anxiety. And before we know it, right, we're anxious about feeling anxious. This is crazy. We do this all the time, even on an everyday kind of level. If you think about the last time, I don't know, you had a wobbly tooth. You know it's wobbly, and you know that it hurts. But what do every 20, 30 seconds? I don't know. It does hurt. And we reinforce the storyline, right? And we just keep telling ourselves. And we do it all the time. And it's only in learning to watch the mind in this way that we can start to let go of those storylines and patterns of mind. But when you sit down and you watch the mind in this way, you might see many different patterns. You might find a mind that's really sort of restless and the whole time, don't be surprised if you feel a bit agitated in your body when you sit down to do nothing and your mind feels like that. You might find a mind that's very sort of dull and boring and it's just almost mechanical. It just sort of seems it's as if you're just sort of getting up, going to work, eat, sleep, get up. Or it might just be that one little nagging thought that just goes round and round and round to your mind. Whatever it is, meditation offers the opportunity, the potential to step back and to get a different perspective, to see that things aren't always as they appear. You know, we can't change every little thing that happens to us in life, but we can change the way that we experience it. That's the potential of meditation, of mindfulness. You don't have to burn any incense, and you definitely don't have to sit on the floor. All you need to do is to take 10 minutes out a day to step back, to familiarize yourself with the present moment so that you get to experience a greater sense of focus, calm, and clarity in your life. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I'm sure you're thinking, holy Toledo's, she just took us on a 1980s self-help weekend retreat. But no, rest assured that's not the case. This is an example of developing soft skills. This idea of being able to focus on things, to relax your mind, to allow your brain to focus and make choices and decisions. And at the end, I'll show you where there's a couple of articles for reading more on the science-backed version of mindfulness. And then on another note, I want you to realize that there are many high stakes companies today that are actually teaching and training their employees in mindfulness practices in order to increase productivity. So it is definitely a sought after soft skill in the industry today. In keeping with that theme, let's take a look at the choices of successful students. It's on page 35 in your textbook. And I just want to highlight a couple of things, aspects of this, so that you can maybe highlight in your textbook or write some notes about these ideas in healthy choices. And let's talk about a couple of these examples. So number 3, master self-management. This is that idea of needing to have dedication and persistence, needing to be someone who never gives up, keeping persistence in adversity. Number 4, employing interdependence. Interdependence isn't about relying on someone else or a weakness in ourselves. It is that idea that we're employing a mutually supportive relationship in order to achieve our goals, but also looking at partnerships today on how we can achieve goals together. Employing interdependence is another one of those company today modern soft skills that companies are looking for in teamwork or group think tanks. It's that style of open office spaces, looking for innovative collaboration. The more that we learn to employ interdependence, the better we're going to achieve our goals and dreams, but also what a tremendous skill to have for our upcoming workforce. Number 6 is an interesting one, learning to adopt a lifelong learning. That's not the person that your old granny still loves to read and learn things, but is that idea that economists and economic development agencies and people shift and change jobs 5 times in their lifetime. That is a reality. And so this idea of lifelong learning is that ability to relearn, to retool ideas, to learn something new, and to embrace that change. Number 7, this idea of emotional intelligence, I think is unbelievably gifted for successful students. That person who is able to effectively manage their emotions to support their goals and their dreams. It's driving them and balancing this ability with managing our emotions. It's those two things put together. Um, on the struggling side, and I don't really want to read those to you, but on the struggling side, if you take a look at some of the struggling, um, there are similar attributes to that self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, see, this is how it is, so therefore I can prove it to be right. What we believe is often what we make happen for ourselves. So, for example, I'm a lousy writer. I was just never was good at writing. We do actions maybe subconsciously, to prove this. Our attitude that limits our beliefs, or we can have that attitude that builds them up. The brain is a miraculous organism and organ in our body. It can learn, it's moldable, it's changeable, and we can learn. It's this idea of neuroplasticity, which is fascinating to me, that your body can learn things. We become what we believe. Great movie, The Help. This is a great mantra. I've seen some modern versions of this, but take a second. Let's just listen to this.
You is kind, you is smart, you is important, you is smart, you is kind, you is important. Oh, that's so good.
So is it just this mantra that someone's telling us, or is it truly the idea of neuroplasticity? And I believe that it's definitely the brain learning, and we can convince ourselves that we can learn new things and grow. So this video, again, it's a little bit longer. It's about 14 minutes, and it talks about neuroplasticity and the brain as a learning organism. And we'll come back around and bring this back full circle to this idea of making wise choices in our forks in the road.
So how do we learn? And why do some of us learn things more easily than others? So as I was mentioned, I'm Dr. Laura Boyd. I'm a brain researcher here at the University of British Columbia. These are the questions that fascinate me. So brain research is one of the great frontiers in the understanding of human physiology, and also in the consideration of what makes us who we are. It's an amazing time to be a brain researcher, and I would argue to you that I have the most interesting job in the world. What we know about the brain is changing at a breathtaking pace. And much of what we thought we knew and understood about the brain turns out to be not true or incomplete. Now, some of these misconceptions are more obvious than others. For example, we used to think that after childhood, the brain really could not change. And it turns out that nothing could be farther from the truth. Another misconception about the brain is that you only use parts of it at any given time and it's silent when you do nothing. Well, this is also untrue. It turns out that even when you're at rest and thinking of nothing, your brain is highly active. So it's been advances in technology, such as MRI, has allowed us to make these and many other important discoveries. And perhaps the most exciting, the most interesting and transformative of these discoveries is that every time you learn a new fact or skill, you change your brain. It's something we call neuroplasticity. So as little as 25 years ago, we thought that after about puberty, the only changes that took place in the brain were negative. The loss of brain cells with aging, the result of damage, like a stroke. And then studies began to show remarkable amounts of reorganization in the adult brain. And the ensuing research has shown us that all of our behaviors change our brain, that these changes are not limited by age. It's good news, right? And in fact, they're taking place all the time. And very importantly, brain reorganization helps to support recovery after you damage your brain. The key to each of these changes is neuroplasticity. So what does it look like? So your brain can change in three very basic ways to support learning. And the first is chemical. So your brain actually functions by transferring chemical signals between brain cells, what we call neurons, and these trigger a series of actions and reactions. So to support learning, your brain can increase the amount or the concentrations of these chemical signaling that's taking place between neurons. Now, because this kind of change can happen very rapidly, this supports short-term memory or the short-term improvement in the performance of a motor skill. The second way that the brain can change to support learning is by altering its structure. So during learning, the brain can change the connections between neurons. Now here, the physical structure of the brain is actually changing, so this takes a bit more time. These types of changes are related to long-term memory, the long-term improvement in a motor skill. Now, these processes, they interact, and let me give you an example of how. So we've all tried to learn a new motor skill, maybe playing the piano, maybe learning to juggle. And you've had the experience of getting better and better within a single session of practice and thinking, I've got it. And then maybe you've returned the next day and all those improvements from the day before, they're lost. What happened? Well, in the short term, your brain was able to increase the chemical signaling between your neurons. But for some reason, those changes did not induce the structural change that are necessary to support long-term memory. Remember that long-term memories take time, and what you see in the short term does not reflect learning. It's these physical changes that are now going to support long-term memories and chemical changes that support short-term memories. Structural changes also can lead to integrated networks of brain regions that function together to support learning. And they can also lead to certain brain regions that are important for very specific behaviors to change their structure or to enlarge. And so here's some examples of that. So people who read Braille, they have larger hand sensory areas in their brain than those of us who don't. Your dominant hand motor region, which is on the left side of your brain, if you're right-handed, is larger than the other side. And research shows that London taxi cab drivers who actually have to memorize a map of London to get their taxi cab license, they have larger brain regions devoted to spatial or mapping memories. Now, the last way that your brain can change to support learning is by altering its function. As you use a brain region, it becomes more and more excitable and easy to use again. And as your brain has these areas that increase their excitability, the brain shifts how and when they're activated. With learning, we see that whole networks of brain activity are shifting and changing. So neuroplasticity is supported by chemical, by structural, and by functional changes. And these are happening across the whole brain. They can occur in isolation from one another, but most often they take place in concert. Together, they support learning, and they're taking place all the time. So I've just told you really how awesomely neuroplastic your brain is. So why can't you learn anything you choose to with ease? Why do our kids sometimes fail in school? Why, as we age, do we tend to forget things? And why don't people fully recover from brain damage? That is, what is it that limits and facilitates neuroplasticity? And so this is what I study. I study it specifically how it relates to recovery from stroke. So recently, stroke dropped from being the third leading cause of death in the United States to be the fourth leading cause of death. Great news, right? Well, it actually turns out that the numbers of people having a stroke has not declined. We're just better at keeping people alive after a severe stroke. It turns out to be very difficult to help the brain recover from stroke. And frankly, we have failed to develop effective rehabilitation interventions. The net result of this is that stroke is the leading cause of long-term disability in adults in the world. Individuals with stroke are younger and tending to live longer with that disability. And research from my group actually shows that the health-related quality of life of Canadians with stroke has declined. So clearly we need to be better at helping people recover from stroke. And this is an enormous societal problem, and it's one that we're not solving. So what can be done? One thing is absolutely clear. The best driver of neuroplastic change in your brain is your behavior. The problem is that the dose of behavior, the dose of practice that's required to learn new and relearn old motor skills, it's very large. And how to effectively deliver these large doses of practice is a very difficult problem. It's also a very expensive problem. So the approach that my research has taken is to develop therapies that prime or that prepare the brain to learn. And these have included brain stimulation, exercise, and robotics. But through my research, I've realized that a major limitation to the development of therapies that speed recovery from stroke is that patterns of neuroplasticity are highly variable from person to person. Now, as a researcher, variability used to drive me crazy. It makes it very difficult to use statistics to test your data and your ideas. And because of this, medical intervention studies are specifically designed to minimize variability. But in my research, it's becoming really clear that the most important, the most informative data that we collect is showing this variability. So by studying the brain after stroke, we've learned a lot, and I think these lessons are very valuable in other areas. So the first lesson is that the primary driver of change in your brain is your behavior. So there's no neuroplasticity drug you can take. Nothing is more effective than practice at helping you learn, and the bottom line is you have to do the work. And in fact, my research has shown that increased difficulty, increased struggle, if you will, during practice actually leads to both more learning and greater structural change in the brain. The problem here is that neuroplasticity can work both ways. It can be positive. You learn something new and you refined a motor skill. It also can be negative, though. You forgot something you once knew. You become addicted to drugs. Maybe you have chronic pain. So your brain is tremendously plastic, and it's being shaped both structurally and functionally by everything you do, but also by everything that you don't do. The second lesson we've learned about the brain is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to learning. So there's no recipe for learning. Consider the popular belief that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to learn and to master a new motor skill. Now, I can assure you it is not quite that simple. For some of us, it's going to take a lot more practice, and for others, it may take far less. So the shaping of our plastic brains it's far too unique for there to be any single intervention that's going to work for all of us. And now this realization have forced us to consider something called personalized medicine. So this is the idea that to optimize outcomes, each individual requires their own intervention. And the idea actually comes from cancer treatments. And here it turns out that genetics are very important in matching certain types of chemotherapy with specific forms of cancer. My research is showing that this also applies to recovery from stroke. So there are certain characteristics of brain structure and function that we call biomarkers. And these biomarkers are proving to be very helpful in helping us to match specific therapies with individual patients. And the data from my lab suggests it's a combination of biomarkers that best predicts neuroplastic change and patterns of recovery after stroke. And that's not surprising given how complicated the human brain is. But I also think we can consider this concept much more broadly. Given the unique structure and function of each of our brains, what we've learned about neuroplasticity after stroke applies to everyone. Behaviors that you employ in your everyday life are important. Each of them is changing your brain. And I believe we have to consider not just personalized medicine, but personalized learning. The uniqueness of your brain will affect you, both as a learner and also as a teacher. And now this idea helps us to understand why some children can thrive in traditional education settings and others don't. Why some of us can learn languages easily, and yet others can pick up any sport and excel. So when you leave this room today, your brain will not be the same as when you entered this morning. And I think that's pretty amazing. But each of you is going to have changed your brain differently. Understanding these differences, these individual patterns, this variability and change, is going to enable the next great advance in neuroscience. It's going to allow us to develop new and more effective interventions and allow for matches between learners and teachers and patients and interventions. And this does not just apply to recovery from stroke. It applies to each of us as a parent, as a teacher, as a manager, and also, because you're at TEDx today, a lifelong learner. Study how and what you learn best. repeat those behaviors that are healthy for your brain and break those behaviors and habits that are not. Practice. Learning is about doing the work that your brain requires. So the best strategies are going to vary between individuals. You know what? They're even going to vary within individuals. So for you, learning music may come very easily, but learning to snowboard, much harder. I hope that you leave today with a new appreciation of how magnificent your brain is. You and your plastic brain are constantly being shaped by the world around you. Understand that everything you do, everything you encounter, and everything you experience is changing your brain. And that can be for better, but it can also be for worse. So when you leave today, go out and build the brain you want. Thank you very much.
So, neuroplasticity is an interesting concept. It's not new. It's something that I always thought, gosh, really, I can make my brain do something different. And in doing the research and listening to the studies and reading the studies, I am a firm believer that the more we do something, the more we practice, that we can learn new things, and that learning is lifelong, that intelligence is not set. And so, two things to take away out of today's forks in the roads and making decisions is this idea of mindfulness, being aware of our mind and our processes, becoming metacognitive, that idea of thinking about what we're doing, and then also being an active learner, learning the way we learn, understanding the way that we acquire knowledge or make changes, and actively making changes in our learning in our brains. Questions about today's lecture, comments that you might have, or ideas that you'd like to share, please post those for your classmates. You may use the peer support forum to post those. Remember, the peer support forum you can access through the introduction module under College Success. There's that link to that discussion post forum. In addition, I have posted links to a couple of articles on mindfulness on the Canvas page. That is the page labeled Forks in the Road Lecture. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me an email and I will respond as soon as possible. Enjoy the second half of the chapter, and I look forward to reading your journals and the next stage of our journey. So let's first examine the idea of forks in the road. As you can see, our arrow is pointing to that point, that fork in the road, where we're going to make a choice. The choices in our life are made every day. Some are really minor, what to wear, what to eat, when to do the laundry. Other choices are life-changing. Some of us get stirred up. It causes anxiety when we're looking at making a decision or making a choice. Often, if we get to a major fork and make decisions with a mindfulness focus, we make a healthy choice. With unclear goals, we can't make choices because we're unclear of where we want to go or where we want to end up in the end. Those with clear goals often are using mindfulness, a metacognitive process, understanding why we're doing what we're doing and the process of the changes. In other words, we're thinking about what we're thinking. We choose a path that is a goal-driven and a healthy, purposeful. We choose the path that is a goal-driven path. An example of unwise choices, I think your textbook outlines this as well. A student with a lower GPA, an example of an unwise choice would be making an all-nighter. That would be an unwise choice. Why? Because it lacks of understanding the process of learning, that it takes time and a process to learn something. But if we're practicing mindfulness, understanding why we do something helps us to make wise choices. The choices of successful students use a metacognitive process. They get a help in the fork in the road. They visualize their goals and their outcomes. They visualize what they want to study and with this and what their outcome or goal for that studying is. Let's take a look at mindfulness in action, the whys and hows. We'll be doing a more in-depth look of mindfulness in weeks 6 and 7, and oftentimes people really enjoy that part. But first,